Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe, I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Joe. How are things in New York?
All right, we're having beautiful weather today, spring-like weather. How about you?
The same. It has me looking forward to the summer when, knock on wood, I will have been vaccinated.
Yes.
And it will be the opportunity to get out and go to restaurants and sit on patios and move among crowds and not wonder whether or not someone is going to infect me with the virus.
Yeah, I hear you. I just scheduled my first vaccination appointment, and hopefully it'll come off without a hitch, so I don't want to jinx it. Listen, before we get to today's topic, I just want to mention that yesterday, New York State legalized the possession of small amounts of marijuana, as
Welcome to the party.
I believe I predicted in our drug legalization episode. So I just wanted to take my victory lap on that prediction, too.
Well deserved.
Yeah.
Well deserved. You are a prognosticator.
And speaking of which, feel free to ask me who's going to win the Kentucky Derby this year for an upcoming podcast, because I might make you and our listeners a lot of money.
Yes, yeah. Though I will not ask you for Wall Street predictions because that might count as insider trading. We don't want to risk any trouble with the SEC.
Good idea. All right, on to this week's question. One of my best friends here in New York is a guy who's worked in digital advertising for a long time. And he's been telling me for years about the gradual loss of local newspapers and what a threat it is to our democracy now that digital means of distribution seem to be taking over. And so his interest in this question kind of shaped the reason why I wanted to ask you about this, because we talk about it a lot. So my question to you was, what does the local journalism landscape look like in light of the fact that so many local newspapers have folded in the last 15 years? And what are the implications for our democracy of the loss of local newspapers? So what did you find?
Well, the first thing I found is a brand new term that I hadn't heard in usage before, which is news desert. And a news desert is a community, a city, town, or county, where the newspaper is becoming a thing of the past. And according to various studies, there were 8,891 newspapers in 2004, but 2,100, or about a fourth, ceased operations over the next 15 years. That included 70 daily newspapers. And half of all U.S. counties have only one newspaper, while more than 2/3 do not have a daily newspaper at all. And 1,000 to 1,500 of the newspapers that remain have scaled back their coverage so much that studies term them, quote, ghost papers, unquote. A local example of this would be the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which has morphed into a website that solely features content from the Associated Press or other affiliate sites. As far as I can tell, the PI no longer employs any journalists at all.
And this is because those newspapers have been basically gutted by their owners, right? All the journalists have been laid off, and they basically just become glorified advertising websites.
Yeah, that's correct, and not necessarily even operated locally. And 171 counties with a total of 3.2 million residents have no newspaper at all. And in the process, from 1978 to 2015, the number of professional journalists declined from 43,000 to 33,000.
Wow.
And I've actually worked with several former reporters over the years. And these were people who chose or were forced to transition into writing or editing jobs on websites and other media. And some of them, I have to say, were pretty bitter about the transition by which their entire industry pretty much collapsed beneath their feet.
Wow.
So according to these studies, people who live in news deserts tend to be more poor and less educated than the national average. Understandably, these were economically marginal communities to begin with, where it's difficult for a newspaper to turn a profit. But Youngstown, Ohio recently became the first large city to lose its sole surviving daily paper. So as you're hearing this, you might be asking yourself, what about television or radio news? And here it gets a little bit fuzzy. There are still television stations in these areas, and those stations probably have nightly news programs, but it is arguably of lower quality. Television and radio stations employ far fewer reporters than newspapers, for instance, and so they tend to feature fewer topics than a newspaper would, and they report fewer original stories rather than just passing on material from an affiliate or national network. Television and radio also are suffering a decline in viewership. Nightly news shows have lost about half their audience since 1980, while the audience for radio news has declined by about 40%. So as I was doing my reading on news deserts, I noticed that alternative media, and in particular social media, is barely mentioned in these studies, except as one of the forces driving newspapers out of business. I will say that if you read up on news deserts, it's important to understand that the people assembling this scholarship are journalists or journalism professors, and rightly or wrongly, they're nostalgic for print journalism specifically. Anything that is not rooted in print, they present as either not as good or just plain bad. So as newspapers fold and local paid journalism is lost, what are some of the consequences? The premise of the news desert thesis is that journalism is necessary for a well-functioning democracy. And we can say that with fewer local journalists, there's going to be less reporting on local issues. And as a consequence, people will be forced to turn to CNN or Fox for the news. And in effect, all of their politics become national politics. And some have argued that the loss of newspapers leads to greater political polarization. There's one study that asserts that newspaper closure led to a 2% decline in split-ticket voting. In other words, the likelihood that you would vote for candidates rather than the straight party ticket. I must personally confess that I am not a split-ticket voter. I don't say that as a point of pride. It's just something that struck me as I was reading the abstract of this study. I'm not sure that has to do with my news consumption, but maybe I just can't see it. Do you ever split your ticket, Joe?
I don't recall having split my ticket. I was born and raised a liberal Democrat and remain so to this day. But I can see how the nationalization of news sources might affect local races in a polarizing kind of way. And I'm thinking about one of our earlier episodes on defund the police. You know, that mantra, defund the police, rightly or wrongly, became one of the big talking points of the year 2020. So I can imagine situations where there are local voters who are inclined to vote for Democrats in local elections or might be at least open to the possibility as a centrist Republican. And having only access, because you're in a news desert, only access to national reporting and all the disinformation on social media, all you hear about Democrats is defund the police, socialism, defund the police. And for that reason, you're probably persuaded not to vote for a local Democrat in a case like that, precisely because you've been starved of local punditry, local journalism that might shine a more balanced light on the political situation in your community. And of course, it could happen the opposite way, too, with Democrats who might want to vote for Republicans, but for all the terrible things they're hearing on their national news sources.
Yeah, well, you certainly have less opportunity to actually hear from those local candidates, because where are they going to show up? Fox News is not going to feature someone who's running for your local city council or school board, and neither will CNN or MSNBC. So in terms of getting to know those candidates and what they stand for and whether or not you relate to them as a person, in the absence of local journalism, there's just very little opportunity unless you happen to go to fundraising events or to press conferences or that sort of thing. And I would say that the majority of citizens just don't engage in that degree of democracy.
And just to tie in another thing you mentioned about news deserts earlier, one of the things I read or that my friend exposed me to is that a preponderance of the news deserts are in the southern United States, in Trump country, rural areas. So it might especially be those voters who are not getting exposed to diversity of opinion and therefore much less likely to split their ticket or consider an alternative.
Yeah. So definitely as local papers fold and with fewer reporters working the beat, there will be less oversight of local politicians. And there's a study by economists of newspaper closures between 1996 and 2015 that argues that the loss of local news coverage tended to be followed by higher long-term borrowing costs for cities, which they attributed to a lack of scrutiny over local deals. So this one's not easy to get your head around, but basically what they're saying is without local reporters sniffing around for a story, corruption and mismanagement go unexposed, and as a result, citizens end up paying more in taxes and fees. Others, meanwhile, have argued that newspaper closure leads to less community involvement. There have been studies asserting that newspapers create a sense of community identity. When you're all reading the same thing, you're drawing on a single source of truth, and you're likely to identify the same things as important. One study of newspaper closures in Kentucky asserted that they led to a decline in the number of people voting in city elections, a smaller number of candidates in those elections, and an increase in the chance that incumbents would retain their seats. One study particularly caught my eye because it focused on newspapers closing in Seattle and Denver, and so this one is more personal for me. And the study argued that the newspaper closures in those cities led to a statistically significant decline in civic engagement, which was defined as the percentage of citizens who contacted a representative, joined a local organization, or got involved in some civic or political issue affecting their community. I will say, though, that I have some issues with this study. First, it's a pretty small sample size that only looks at 2 cities. In Seattle, the Post-Intelligencer did close as an active newspaper, though as we've discussed, it still has sort of a ghost presence. But in 2009, we still had the Seattle Times, 2 alternative weeklies, and a monthly Seattle magazine. So local print news sources were quite abundant at the time. And then this was focusing on a decline in engagement from 2008 to 2009. But you'll remember, Joe, that 2008 was the year that Obama got elected to his first term. And I remember what it was like in Seattle during that election. It was electric. People were already pumped about Obama as a candidate, but then when McCain selected Sarah Palin as his running mate, it just turned everything up to 11. And that's the sort of supercharged historic moment that's going to throw a lot of noise into measures of civic engagement.
Right.
And then finally, the significant decline, quote unquote, in Seattle the following year amounted to only about 1%. And the authors admit that in Denver, their measures of civic engagement actually rebounded in subsequent years. So this study, I'm not coloring me unconvinced. So there are studies showing a correlation between newspapers closing and various bad things happening. The effect is sometimes small, however, and it's an ongoing question whether, in this case, correlation signifies causation. And as I was doing my reading for this episode, I kept wondering, it does sound reasonable that quality journalism would contribute to a well-functioning democracy. But does history bear that out? Newspapers in this country have a history going back to the 17th century, and very little of that time was spent on investigative journalism. Prior to the 1830s, most U.S. newspapers were aligned with a political party or platform, and they existed solely in order to get candidates elected. Some were purely mercantile, reporting, for instance, which ships were coming into harbor. Some served specific communities or ideologies, and churches and Catholic dioceses had their own newspapers. And other papers served immigrant communities, with articles helping new arrivals navigate this strange place called America. The absolute heyday of newspapers was the period between 1890 and 1920. In the early 1900s, there was an estimated 24,000 weekly and daily publications. These were, after all, the days before the internet, before television, before even radio. Newspapers were the only game in town, and journalism was king. Reportedly, the average American read several papers a day. The average literate American, of course. Right. In 1900, the literacy rate was about 90%. And I don't know if you know, but the term yellow journalism actually dates to this period, though I have heard 2 separate origins for the term. The first, that the papers at this time were published on cheap paper that would quickly take on a yellowish tinge. And the second, that the term was coined by a battle between 2 New York papers over rights to publish a popular cartoon of the day called The Yellow Kid. And if you're wondering, that cartoon was even more racist than its title would imply. So if the early 20th century was the heyday of journalism, can we say that the earliest 20th century was also a period of especially strong democracy? I had a hard time thinking of examples of when journalism has explicitly served our democracy. There is the obvious example, Watergate, and the hero journalists Woodward and Bernstein, documented and to some extent glamorized in All the President's Men. I think every journalist's dream is to be played by Robert Redford.
Right. And who I believe were serving as local journalists at the time. I mean, they worked for the Washington Post, but they were the local Washington, D.C. bureau and not national bureau, if I remember correctly.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. But aside from Watergate, I honestly struggled to think of other examples. But what I was able to do was think of times when the press had a manifest opportunity to serve truth and democracy, but missed that opportunity. For instance, in 1921, local Tulsa newspapers fanned the flames of racist resentment of the black community. One story in the Tulsa Tribune carried the headline, quote, "Nabbed Negro for attacking girl in an elevator," unquote. The ensuing race riot and massacre resulted in at least 37 deaths, though some estimates run as high as 300, and left an entire neighborhood in ashes. In the 1950s, when Joe McCarthy was accusing random people of treason, the press didn't take him down. For the most part, they egged him on with breathless front-page coverage of his baseless accusations. Likewise, the press didn't go after Jim Crow laws or the unjust internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. It would seem that, instead of campaigning for truth, justice, and the American way, what the press largely tends to do is reflect the sentiments of the day, and sometimes those sentiments can be pretty ugly. There's an extent to which the advocates of print journalism are talking about how they think newspapers ought to function, or might function if given the chance. But we should be careful of a false nostalgia for a lost golden age in which crusading journalists kept politicians honest and a well-read citizenry were fully engaged in their communities. It seems like for most of American history, that's been more ideal than real.
I hear you on the overall point about the self-important, self-referential nature of this question, that it's coming from journalists who kind of pine for this perhaps mythologized heyday of journalism. But I still feel like even if the history of journalism is not a history of investigative journalism per se, there's still a value in local newspapers simply reporting the facts. I'm thinking of a thing like the Flint water crisis, where the national papers and all social media and politicized outlets were reporting the governor of Michigan's doublespeak on that issue, denial of what was happening and obfuscation, where all the local journalists were simply reporting on the fact that the Flint water was colored brown and showing these local TV and news pieces about discolored water coming out of people's taps and people getting poisoned by the water and amplifying the message of how the water was full of lead. And I don't think that story would have gotten the traction it did nationally without the reporting of facts by those local outlets. So even if they're not investigative journalists per se, I think they still perform a vital function. Don't you think?
I would agree. I think local journalism was critical for exposing the Flint, Michigan scenario. And that's a great example of where local journalism can really shine, because Flint was being treated the way it was by its government because its citizenry were marginal. They were poor, they were largely black, they lacked power in the state. And so more mainstream, more large-scale media outlets that were focused on the white middle class simply did not report on that issue until local journalists made it impossible to ignore. So that is a good counterexample.
And also, these were not crusading investigative journalists out to take down the governor and get indictments against the governor's consultants, which is what ended up happening. These were simply local journalists who went out to homes in their community to cover this phenomenon of the water being dirty and the source of the water being rerouted. Very fact-heavy reporting. And if a community doesn't have that, then it's missing potential exposure of a lot of bad things going on.
Right. But either way, the old newspaper model is gone for good. The modern newspaper, after all, was an all-encompassing beast of content, with sections for local and national news, sports, humor, opinion, food and dining, entertainment, financial news. It was a lot. And all those different sections required very large newsrooms overseen by lots of editors, and then printers and delivery people and so on. It was a manpower-intensive operation. I don't know about you, Joe, but personally, I would read the front section, the sports, and the funny pages. I would like to say that I recycled the rest of the paper, but we didn't really have recycling when I was a newspaper subscriber. So those other sections went directly into landfill.
Yeah. And you're not a newspaper subscriber anymore?
I have not been for quite some time, no. I'm post-paper.
I still get the New York Times print edition, so I'm old-fashioned that way. 7 days a week.
So out of character with you, Joe, you also still use a flip phone, right?
Actually, I don't have any phone.
You're just banging on rocks. So this breadth was a necessary function of the business model. Newspapers needed that breadth of content to bring in a wide enough audience that advertisers would want to buy space. Newspapers did sell subscriptions, but most of their revenue came from advertising and classified ads. And for some papers, it was actually the classified ads that brought in 70% of their ad revenue, which left them in a very precarious position even when times were good. Because I'm old enough to remember what it was like to look through classified ads for a job.
Me too.
It was not a good experience. They were text only and poorly sorted, so if I was looking for a writing or an editing job, I was looking through ads for plumbers and electricians and telemarketing people and absolutely everybody else.
Right.
You really had to set aside time to search through them. It was a lot of work.
And I acquired my first job by answering a classified ad for a college graduate.
Yeah, that's all they said, college graduate needed?
Pretty much, yeah. It turned out to be a temporary paralegal agency. But yeah, that's how I got my first post-college job. And rather than weeding through plumber and electrician, I just went straight to the letter C, college grad.
And then Craigslist came along with something that was right out of the box quite a bit better. Now the ads had pictures, they were searchable. As a seller, you didn't need to put your phone number in the ad, which offered a lot more security. And it happened to be free. I once sat in on a talk given by a newspaper editor in Chicago where he complained quite angrily about how Craigslist had stolen his revenue. But if you rely that much on asking people to pay for what was, in hindsight, a pretty bad product, that's going to happen. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will happen. And all told, newspapers lost 60% of their ad revenue between 2005 and 2014. It's worth mentioning that it didn't help that while the digital media were challenging newspaper revenue streams, large media conglomerates were also busy buying up all the papers. Those businesses took on a ton of debt just as the revenue started to decline, and the result was pretty disastrous. So when we look to the future of news, it looks smaller and more specialized. In a digital world in which CNN and the New York Times are only a click away, there's no good reason that you'd go to a local paper for national or international news. If you want a new recipe, there are hundreds of food bloggers to choose from, and they're all a Google search away, so forget about the newspaper food section. For travel ideas and insight, specialized sites like TripAdvisor do a much better job than any local paper could dream of, so cross the travel section off as well. And for the sports section, you can get your sports from ESPN or from the fan community. A big light bulb moment for me, and part of why I stopped being a newspaper subscriber, is the moment when I realized as a Seattle Mariners fan that the best, most in-depth coverage of the Mariners wasn't in the local papers. It was on blogs like USS Mariner or Lookout Landing. These sources weren't merely free, they also were better than what I was finding on the pages of the Seattle Times. They published a lot more material. They didn't just talk about wins and losses. They went into analysis of why the team was winning or losing, something that the more professional operations seemed quite reluctant to do. It wasn't long before I was reading those blogs every day and completely ignoring the Times sports section. So it's often said that you can't compete with free, but actually you can. If you offer something of higher quality, lots of people will pay for it. That's, after all, how fine dining competes with McDonald's. People will pay for a better version of the thing that they want. If the free stuff is better, though, than what you're asking people to pay for, that's when you've got a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the only thing that a local paper can do better than anyone else is cover local news. So the modern newsroom can be much smaller than previously was. That's not good news if you're a journalist looking for a job, but it's potentially good news if you're thinking about founding a news source in your hometown. Fewer employees means lower operating costs. So if newspapers are going away, what's going to replace them? For starters, television news is probably not going away, and neither is radio. So there will be something.
It seems to me that the atomization of information is affecting them as well. So they may not fold up and die, but many fewer people are watching the networks or even cable stations or listening to major radio sources because there's just so many other things to choose from, including podcasts like this one.
Yeah, they'll continue to exist. They will just serve a smaller audience. Though trust in all media is trending downwards. In this country, that's particularly true on the right as a consequence of Trump's grievance politics and Fox News' willingness to amplify that message. Fewer than 40% of Americans say that they trust most of the news most of the time. And this will definitely be a drag on any journalism comeback story that we hope to write. If people don't really trust the media, they're not going to support it with their dollars or their attention. Meanwhile, as you mentioned, radio's quirky offshoot, podcasting, is growing rapidly. And trust studies show that people are far more likely to trust an average person than an institution. So amateur podcasters like you and me are generally held to be more trustworthy than professional journalists. So what do you think, Joe? Are we journalists here on mansplaining? Is that what we do?
Most definitely not. But I do want to take issue with one thing you just said about the trust factor. It is clear that people don't trust the media writ large, and that's both sides of the political spectrum. But I think there's a long-standing phenomenon of while you might hate Congress, say, you don't hate your local congressperson. And so I'm imagining that while you may hate the media writ large, you have an affectionate spot in your heart for your local newspaper or your local radio station. And that's probably going to remain true going forward.
I think it's possible. I'm not sure it's true because I'm remembering reading through that trust study that I just alluded to. And trust in larger figures, so congresspeople, CEOs, presidents, celebrities, has been steadily declining over time, mostly because people just question their motives. Like, I think you might vote for your congressman even if you think that he or she is a slave to special interests because their opponent will seem worse to you because the media you consume tells you that either Democrats are tools of the Antichrist or Republicans are nativist, nationalist, racists, gunslingers.
Right.
And so I think it's probably somewhere in the middle, but I do believe that the farther up the chain you go in terms of celebrity and authority, the less people find you trustworthy. And that doesn't necessarily correlate with finding you unlikable, but people are most likely to trust people who look and sound like them, which I think is actually a factor of podcasting rise, is because most podcasters are not celebrities. And Barack Obama has a podcast, but most podcasters are not Barack Obama. And so people see podcasters as simply more relatable, and because they're relatable, they find them more trustable, which is why I think podcasting actually has a future in the news landscape, but probably not so much for news reporting as for news analysis, I would say.
Agreed.
So there have been efforts to, in effect, tax Facebook and Google for linking to news stories as a way of funding journalism. As you might have read, Australia recently tried this with a new law, which was, by the way, reportedly cooked up by Rupert Murdoch himself. They came up with a law that said that Google and Facebook would have to pay a fee for linking to news stories on Australian news sites. But this sort of thing is unlikely to be a solution, I'd say. First off, because it's way too easy for these sources to simply stop linking to those news outlets, which is exactly what Facebook did when the law was first passed, which seems to have caught absolutely everybody by surprise. And eventually they did work out a negotiated settlement, but at any moment either Facebook or Google could simply turn off the news links. And the consequences for that would be much more severe for the news sites than it would be for the digital companies.
Yeah.
In any case, money that comes from this sort of link tax is more likely to roll into big national corporations like Fox News or CNN. Smaller sites and local journalism probably won't see much of a benefit.
So the rich will get richer. Yeah.
Exactly. Meanwhile, some people are hoping for government support. We already fund PBS and NPR, so the thinking goes we should just ramp that up to support local journalism as well. Under the current model, much of the government funding for local public broadcasting stations goes right back to the national organization in affiliate fees. So there is some thinking around allowing local stations to keep more of that money.
And also, government funding is not the way forward on things like this. I mean, I work for public media, and literally every year there are Congress people threatening to zero out funding. So you can't sustain a business relying on that kind of lack of commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just one Congress vote away from completely going away. So it's not a growth plan.
Right. You need an endowment in order to keep public media alive long term, and that's precisely what nobody's willing to commit to. So if we can't even do that with public media, the most trusted source of news and everything tops the polls every year, then there's no way that government is going to be the savior of local journalism.
Seems unlikely. In a completely different sector, we have been seeing some growth in micro-targeted newspapers. There's actually been a recent resurgence of independently owned ethnic and minority news operations. By focusing on a very specific audience, these publications can be the sole source of news on topics that larger operations don't bother to cover. It's not a very profitable niche, but some operations are making it work, especially within the Hispanic and Latino community in the South and Southwest. There are more than 200 Hispanic newspapers, many with only 1 or 2 newsroom employees. The nonprofit model is also interesting, which is news operations that are funded by grants and donations. Somewhat ironically, in 2019, Mark Zuckerberg pledged to donate $300 million to support local journalism over the following 3 years. So presumably he's about halfway into that investment by now. And there are examples like ProPublica and the Texas Tribune on the national stage, and Charlottesville Tomorrow or Vermont Digger within local markets that are actually making the nonprofit model work. The Institute for Nonprofit News counts more than 230 nonprofit newsrooms, with a new one launching about once per month. Half of these newsrooms cover state and local news, and these nonprofits together employ about 2,000 journalists. The INN has a goal of 20,000 nonprofit journalists by 2030. Nonprofit status does, however, require these operations to steer clear of certain topics. For instance, they are prohibited by law from making political endorsements. But that does appear to be a growing sector of local journalism.
The problem with nonprofit funding, of course, is that you're relying on grants and large donations from wealthy people. And as I know all too well from working in the nonprofit sector, as soon as the economy takes a downturn, the first thing that people stop doing is donating to charities. So you're relying on the vicissitudes of the market, and that's just not a prescription for long-term survival.
Yeah, that could well be. There are other operations that are subscription funded. The New York Times, for instance, has a paywall, but there are also much smaller operations that are following the same model. There's a tech news analysis operation that I quote every now and then on this podcast called Stratechery, and it's a one-man subscription service with regular content delivered via email and the web. On a similar level, I get a daily email digest of Seattle news researched and written by a single guy. So there is a niche there for a motivated individual to build up a subscription list. It's definitely limited in scope because it's just one guy working, but some people are diving into that sector. And then finally, there's the elephant in the room, social media. 53% of U.S. adults say they get news from social media often or sometimes, and this is particularly true among younger Americans. Sometimes that news is culled from news sources, but often it's just awareness of what's happening in the world, which is coming from what other people are posting or tweeting. So it's someone in New York, for instance, alerting you to what's happening on the streets of New York. During the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, for instance, my first stop for what is happening right now, when it seemed possible that federal troops might attack protesters, was not to go to news sources. I went online and I checked Twitter, and I spent quite a bit of time on Snapchat, because Snapchat has this very interesting function where you can click on a map and it brings up what people are posting in that specific area. So that's a completely alternative way of finding out what's happening in the world, which has nothing in particular to do with traditionally funded journalism. Meanwhile, 36% of Americans regularly get their news from Facebook. Twitter is already a very important tool for journalists. It's used by only about 1 in 4 Americans, but fully half of their users regularly consume news on that platform, and I'm one of them. Reddit also has a lot of news-based content that has a smaller user base than as a social platform. This surprised me when I read it. Instagram is growing in importance as a news source, particularly within the Black American community. Instagram. I would not have guessed that. So who knows? Maybe TikTok is going to be the next big thing in news consumption among younger news consumers.
But we're talking about consumption. I want to talk more about the production of news. I'm just imagining as you're scrolling through these various things that might take the place of local papers. I'm thinking back to the example of the dogged local crime reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, who were sent by their editor to investigate a break-in at a hotel one day, right? Before we knew that this was related to national politics and would actually bring down the sitting presidential administration. It was just a local break-in. So I'm wondering who's covering that? Not the niche stratechery, because it doesn't have anything to do with tech, or the Dominican news service, or the Snapchat is not covering it because there's nobody in the general public knows that there's a break-in happening at the Watergate Hotel. So I don't understand how important events like that will be covered.
Well, I think probably the answer to that is things are going to bubble up through other means. Like, look back to the Black Lives Matter protests. They were kicked off when a black man was murdered in Minneapolis. And how did we find out about that? It wasn't a journalist who ran down that story.
Yeah.
We didn't need Woodward and Bernstein to find us for that. It was some dude with his phone who filmed it and posted it, and other people amplified it, and then it became a news story.
It's a very good point.
So injustice, I think, tends to find an audience because there are certain factors that encourage people to share things on social media, and outrage is pretty much the number one factor. That's always going to find an audience, is when someone records something, an act of injustice, an act of brutality. And then for things like where you really need to go through financial records, for instance, for the story, maybe we're going to be relying on the ProPublicas of the world. Journalists who are funded by alternative means or through a subscription paywall or whatever it is. And through that patchwork, the various things will come into focus. Because I think what we're definitely heading to is what we already have to a certain extent today, which is a fragmented landscape.
Yes.
You're going to find your news in many small places rather than a single omnibus source. And that's probably going to produce more filter bubbles. If you opt into news sources, confirmation bias will make sure that you opt into the ones that present news and opinion that you already agree with. And the overall effect may be increased polarization, with fewer opportunities for people who disagree with you to challenge your viewpoint, or vice versa. The flip side to that is micro-targeted news that's online has the opportunity to amplify local issues and voices in a way that old-school community newspapers never could have. Really, the Black Lives Matter protest is such an excellent example of new voices today that were never articulated before. Like, even in their heyday, Woodward and Bernstein weren't unlocking the voice of the man in the street. The man in the street today has a voice. And I think we are still struggling for what to do with that voice. We tend to ricochet from one crisis to another. But I think it's probably a pretty undeniable good that the voiceless now have a voice.
I completely agree with that. But I do wonder if the future looks like what you're saying it's going to look like. What does it mean then to be a journalist? why would you go to journalism school if all you have to be is some dude with a camera on the site of a police shooting or arrest or something to document what's going on? We're becoming a nation of citizen journalists. So
Right. Yeah.
do we need to have professional journalists anymore? I mean, to ask the devil's advocate question.
I think that's a terrific question. And I hope that in addition to writing about news deserts and pining for the golden age of print journalism, I hope that journalist organizations and professors are thinking hard about that as well. Like, what does journalism look like when possibly your most powerful source of the story is just someone on Twitter or TikTok or Facebook or Instagram? It's, I think, the critical question for news.
I would like to believe that there's something in their training and their precision with which they approach an issue that is worth the price of journalism school and makes them maybe a better arbiter of what's going on in the world than just these citizen journalists with their phones. Am I old-fashioned in that way?
You're always a little bit old-fashioned, Joe, but that's
True.
what makes you. So to sum it up, I would say that as tempting as it is to proclaim that the future of journalism will either be a blissful utopia or a nightmarish dystopia, the reality is probably somewhere in between, like it pretty much always has been in this America that we call home. So, did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Although I found this one was more troubling than in prior subjects because I find it disquieting that professional journalism seems to be going away. And even though there are definitely salutary aspects of what's replacing it, I worry about a world where there's no such thing as expertise anymore.
Yeah.
And things are not perhaps handled as professionally as they could be.
Yeah, I get that. It's definitely a risk.
One thing that struck me while you were speaking is I was thinking how local newspapers are similar to retail in that communities often want to support their local retailers because the profits from local retail will be reinvested in the community. And I wonder whether there's a link here to local journalism as well. That maybe people will not be so pleased about some hedge fund or some national conglomerate owning their local newspaper for that reason. Yeah. Because there's no real interest or desire to reinvest in the community. It's just about extracting profits.
Yeah. That would be a great pitch for a local paper, particularly a community paper, right. One of the ethnic or micro-targeted newspapers that we talked about, to ask for support from that community because it is a part of that community. And for that, it's critical that the editor and the publisher live in the community and that they be reporting on issues that are of importance to that community. I think that would be pretty compelling.
Yes.
So are you ready for next week's question?
I am. Hit me.
Okay. So let's talk meat. You mentioned in our previous episode that farting and belching cows are a significant producer of greenhouse gases.
Uh-oh.
And in general, the raising of animals for meat is a wasteful and environmentally damaging process. There are companies out there trying to get us to a post-meat future, whether that be plant-based imitation meat or animal cells grown in a petri dish. In movies like Snowpiercer or Soylent Green, imagine a future in which we're all eating insect protein or even recycled human corpses. So my question to you, Joe, what is the future of meat, and will there soon come a day when steak and hamburgers have become historical relics?
All right. So back to those cows and their belching.
Don't forget about the farting.
Yes. Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. I will look into that. And I'll let you know.
Okay.
All right. And if you folks out there like this episode of Mansplaining or want to leave a comment about this or any other episode of the podcast, please go to our Facebook page, which is conveniently titled Mansplaining the Podcast. We welcome your feedback, including topic ideas for future episodes. But that's it for this edition of Mansplaining. That was Mark. I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye, everybody. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.